They didn't say it as an insult. They said it as a warning. Before every patrol, before every moonless departure into the swallowing dark of the North African desert, the men of the British Special Air Service would turn to their American counterparts, nod once, and leave 4 words hanging in the desert air like the smell of cordite. Don't follow us in. And then they vanished, not retreating, not running, simply gone, absorbed into the night as if the sand itself had swallowed them whole. Now ask yourself this. What kind of soldiers disappear so completely that even their allies cannot track them? What kind of war doctrine is so severe, so ruthlessly stripped of comfort that even the bravest men in the United States Army were told, politely but firmly, that they were not ready for what came next? And why, in the history of the Second World War, has this moment, this precise cultural collision between 2 different philosophies of violence, been almost entirely forgotten? Stay until the end, because the answer to those questions will change how you understand not just the SAS, but the entire nature of special operations warfare. And it begins not with a general, not with a briefing room, and not with a plan drawn on a map. It begins with silence. It is the spring of 1942. The Libyan desert, 200 miles southwest of Benghazi High. The night is absolute. No moon, no wind. The temperature has dropped to near freezing, though hours earlier it scorched at over 40 degrees Celsius. The desert does not compromise. It offers nothing in the middle. It is brutal in heat and merciless in cold. And in the spaces between the rocky escarpments and the bone-white salt flats, in the particular blackness that exists only in places where no electricity has ever been strung and no fire has been lit in living memory, in that darkness, 4 men are moving. They are not running. They are not crouching in the Hollywood crouch of men playing at war. They are walking in a single file with a measured rolling footfall. Their boots have been wrapped in cloth at the sole. Their weapons are secured tight against their bodies so that nothing swings, nothing catches the air, nothing produces the faintest percussion of metal on metal. Their faces are darkened. Their kit has been inspected 3 separate times, once by their section commander, once by their patrol leader, and once by themselves, to eliminate any item that might rattle, reflect light, or carry a smell that the desert wind could translate to an enemy sentry's nose. Between these 4 men, there is no conversation. There has been no conversation for 11 hours. There will be no conversation for another 7. They carry with them a small canvas bag. Inside that bag, wrapped in an oilcloth against the dew, are 4 objects no larger than a man's fist. They are brown, unremarkable, slightly waxy to the touch, the product of weeks of clandestine experimentation by a Welsh Australian lieutenant who had nearly blown off his own hand, arriving at the formula. They are called Lewes bombs. And before the sun rises over the eastern horizon, these 4 quiet men and their 4 quiet objects will reduce 40,000 pounds of German aviation fuel and at least a dozen aircraft to black. Smoking ruins. Nobody will see them arrive. Nobody will hear them go. The enemy, when they discover the devastation at first light, will not believe that fewer than a dozen hands could have produced so much destruction. They will double the guard. They will search the roads. They will interrogate their own sentries. And the men who did it will already be 25 miles away, camouflaged beneath camouflage netting stretched over shallow digs in the rock, sleeping soundly in the burning midday sun, waiting for the next night. This was the Special Air Service. And this, the science and the religion of absolute invisibility, was everything to understand why the SAS left American units behind before every patrol. You must first understand that the SAS itself was born from an active spectacular, near-fatal failure. In the summer of 1941, there were no special forces in the British Army in the modern sense. There were commandos, large, Aggressive raiding parties built around the principle that mass and firepower could achieve what subtlety could not. There were long-range desert group patrols, navigating the desert with extraordinary skill, but primarily for reconnaissance rather than direct assault. And there were lay force, a commando brigade that had been sent to the Middle East with grand ambitions, watched those ambitions dissolve in a series of cancelled operations, and was effectively dismantled by the summer of 1941, leaving a large number of trained, brave, deeply bored men scattered across Egyptian camps, wondering where the war had gone. Among those men was a 25-year-old Scottish officer named David Stirling. Stirling does not fit the mold of the traditional military hero. He had been thrown out of Cambridge for gambling and drinking. He had briefly intended to become a painter in Paris. He had been training for an attempt on Mount Everest when the war interrupted him. He was so tall, 6 feet 5 inches, and so seemingly uninterested in military convention that his commanding officers regarded him as a charming problem rather than a serious soldier. He was nearly put on a charge for malingering in Egypt. He was, in every conventional military sense, an unlikely founder of anything, but Stirling possessed something that the Army's finest generals did not. He possessed the capacity to think about warfare not as a problem of mass and momentum, but as a problem of access and surprise. He understood, from instinct more than doctrine, that a small number of perfectly placed men could achieve what a division of conventionally deployed soldiers could not because small units were braver, but because they were quieter, because they were invisible, because they could exist in the enemy's rear area, not as an invading force, but as a ghost, as something the enemy's entire defensive apparatus was not designed to detect. He arrived at this insight lying flat on his back in the Alexandria Scottish hospital, temporarily paralyzed from the waist down after an unauthorized parachute jump had gone wrong near Mersa Matruh. He had jumped. He had landed badly. He had lost the feeling in his legs for 2 months. But lying there in that hospital bed, unable to move, he had thought more clearly about the nature of desert warfare than most generals thought in a lifetime of active service. The existing commando raids were not working, not because the men were inadequate, but because the philosophy was wrong. Commando raids took dozens of men and deposited them near coastal targets, a submarine or landing craft. They were loud. They depended on firepower for escape. They required enormous logistical support. And because they required so much support, they were visible long before they arrived, planned far in advance, and therefore vulnerable to the intelligence networks that the Germans had already woven through the Mediterranean theater. The enemy always seemed to be ready. Because the enemy always had time to get ready, Stirling's insight was brutal in its simplicity. The answer was not more men. It was fewer. 4 men, each cross-trained in weapons, explosives, navigation, and signals, a self-contained unit requiring almost nothing from outside itself, could move through the desert's deep southern flank, bypassing all defensive lines entirely. 4 men left no track worth following. 4 men made no sound worth hearing. 4 men could live off minimal water and rations for days at a time. And 4 men, placing loose bombs on the wings of grounded aircraft, could destroy in one night what it would take a fighter squadron weeks to accomplish in the air dot in July 1941. Stirling scaled the perimeter fence of the British General Headquarters in Cairo on a pair of crutches. He could barely walk, talked his way past sentries, stumbled into the office of Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie entirely unannounced, and handed him a handwritten memorandum outlining his proposal. 3 days later, he was given permission to recruit 67 men and form L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The name was bluff. There was no brigade. There was barely a regiment. There were 67 volunteers and 3 tents in the desert near Kabrit, 100 miles south of Cairo, and the beginning of something that would change the nature of warfare forever. The man Stirling needed most was not another fighter. It was a teacher. Lieutenant John Steele Lewes, known universally as Jock, was everything Stirling was not. Where Stirling was flamboyant and instinctive, Lewes was methodical and severe. He was a scholar, an Oxford rowing blue, a man for whom physical excellence and intellectual rigor were not opposed values but complementary ones. He had already conducted small raids against Italian outposts in the desert, and from those raids he had drawn lessons so precise and exacting that they amounted to a philosophy of covert warfare. He understood, as few men did in 1941, that the difference between an operator who survived and one who did not was almost never a matter of courage. It was almost always a matter of discipline. At Cabrit, Lewes designed a training program of extraordinary severity. The volunteers trained, not just in weapons and explosives, but in the art of moving. They marched for days across the desert, carrying full loads, learning the rhythm of silent movement, learning how to walk without producing sound, learning how to negotiate rocky ground in the dark without disturbing a single pebble. They trained in the strapping of equipment, every piece of kit tested and tested again for the sound it might produce at the wrong moment. They learned to eat cold food and drink warm, brackish water without complaint, because the alternative, a fire for cooking, a camp stove for warming, was a light source and a smell source that could reach a German aircraft at altitude, or an Italian observation post 3 miles away. Lewes was obsessive about noise discipline. Not merely tactical noise discipline, the obvious prohibition on speaking near the enemy, but structural noise discipline. The concept that silence was not something you achieved at the last moment, 50 yards from the target. Silence was something you built into every piece of equipment, every piece of clothing, every movement and procedure from the moment you left the vehicle to the moment you returned. Silence was architecture. You designed it in. You did not improvise it under pressure. He also invented, through weeks of dangerous experimentation with available materials, thermite, plastic explosive, and oil, the device that became the SAS's signature weapon. The Lewes bomb was a compound incendiary explosive charge so small it could be hidden in a trouser pocket. It weighed under a pound. It could be affixed to the wing of an aircraft in seconds, and it would burn at a temperature so intense that the metal of the wing itself would ignite. Not just damage, ignite. You could not put it out with anything. Available on a desert airfield. One Lewes bomb on aircraft was one aircraft permanently gone, irreplaceable, irretrievable. The device was the physical embodiment of the SAS philosophy. It was small. It was quiet. It was devastating out of all proportion to its apparent size. It required no great force to deploy. It required only precision, patience, and the nerve to be standing within arm's reach of the enemy without making a sound. Got 4 Lewes bombs per man, 4 men per patrol, 16 aircraft destroyed per successful operation. It was arithmetic that made German generals pause and later reach for their intelligence files in bewilderment. The first mission was a catastrophe. Operation Squatter, launched on the night of November 16, 1941, sent 65 SAS men into a sky over Libya in 5 obsolete Bristol Bombay transport aircraft, tasked with parachuting onto 5 Axis airfields near Gazala. The wind that night was 40 miles an hour. The desert had conjured a full sandstorm. The men were scattered across 50 miles of terrain. Equipment containers were lost. Sections were separated and never reformed. Men who landed were concussed, injured, disoriented in a landscape that offered no reference point in any direction. Only 22 men made it back. Of those 65 who jumped, 43 did not return. They died not from German bullets, but from the desert itself, from thirst, exposure, and the particular cruelty of a terrain that offers no shelter to the lost. Not a single aircraft was destroyed. Not a single bomb was placed. The SAS's first mission in history had accomplished absolutely nothing except the near destruction of the unit itself. What happened next defines everything about who these men were. Stirling did not appeal for sympathy. He did not blame the weather, the RAF, the intelligence planners, or the equipment. He went directly to the long-range desert group, the expert desert navigators who had been operating in the deep desert since 1940, and proposed a new model. The LRDG would drive the SAS to within striking distance of targets. The SAS would go in on foot. The LRDG would wait. The SAS would come back out. No parachutes, no dependency on aircraft, no variables introduced by weather at altitude. Just men, vehicles, desert, and darkness. 1 month after the worst failure of his military life, Stirling was operational again, and this time, everything worked. In December 1941, Paddy Mayne led a 6-man section to the Italian airfield at Wadi Tamat in Libya. Robert Blair Mayne was a man of extraordinary physical power, a pre-war international rugby player from Ulster, a man whose dimensions seemed slightly outside the standard human scale. He was also under close arrest when Stirling recruited him for striking his commanding officer. He was exactly the kind of man the British Army's conventional officer class wanted to be rid of. He was exactly the kind of man Stirling needed. Mayne walked his 6 men across the desert to Tamat in silence. They moved on foot through the darkness for hours, navigating by stars, the southern stars of the Libyan night, which Lewes had taught them to read like a map. They approached the airfield perimeter, not from the direction any sentry would have expected, but from the south, from the direction of nothing, from the direction of the great empty desert that no rational army would expect anyone to have crossed. The sentries were awake. They were watching the expected approaches. They were not watching the desert. Mayne's section placed Lewes bombs on 14 aircraft. They blew up an ammunition dump. They destroyed a fuel store. Mayne personally disabled the instrument panel of one aircraft with his bare hands when he ran out of bombs. The entire operation, from the moment they crossed the perimeter wire to the moment they recrossed it, took under an hour. They walked back to the LRDG vehicles in silence. 14 aircraft destroyed. 0 SAS casualties. 0 enemy contact. 2 weeks later, Mayne went back to the same airfield and destroyed 27 more. By the end of 1941. In less than 3 months of operational activity, Mayne's personal count of aircraft destroyed exceeded 100. This was not the accumulated record of a pilot across years of aerial combat. This was one man on foot, in the dark, placing small wax-coated bombs on the wings of sleeping aircraft. The most decorated man in the Royal Air Force at that time had destroyed 41 aircraft in aerial combat. Mayne had destroyed more than twice that number, and he had done it in silence. By 1942, the SAS had grown from 67 men to nearly 400. They had been given their own jeeps, armed with paired Vickers K machine guns. They had earned regimental status. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had put a price of 100,000 Reichsmarks on David Stirling's head, earning him the nickname among the German staff that would define him in history, der Phantommajor, the Phantom Major. And across the sea, America had entered the war. The United States Army arrived in the Mediterranean theater in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied landings along the North African coast. They came in enormous numbers. They came with extraordinary material wealth: jeeps, trucks, artillery, fighter aircraft, canned food in quantities that bewildered even British supply officers accustomed to relative abundance. They came with the confidence of a nation that had industrialized warfare on a scale the world had never seen, and with a doctrine built around that industrialization. American military philosophy in 1942 was, in essence, a philosophy of overwhelm. When in doubt, apply more force. When the enemy resists, bring more guns. When a position cannot be taken, call in air support and artillery until the ground itself submits. This was not arrogance. It was a rational doctrine built around America's genuine strengths. The United States could produce more of everything than any nation on earth. Its soldiers were brave, its commanders intelligent, its supply chains remarkable. In a war of attrition, fought on open terms, the American approach would prove decisive. History proved that without ambiguity, but it was not the SAS approach. And the desert, in 1942, was not yet a war of attrition. The desert was a war of information, of patience, of the ability to exist, undetected, in the enemy's operational rear for days and weeks, without logistical support, without radio contact, without fixed lines of supply or retreat. It was a war in which the man who could be quietest, smallest, and most disciplined over the longest period of time held an advantage no amount of firepower could fully replicate. You could not shell into silence a patrol that no one knew was there. When American units began operating alongside British Special Forces in North Africa, the cultural gap became visible almost immediately. It manifested not in grand strategic disagreement, but in small, precise, operationally critical moments. A footstep on a loose stone, the metallic click of a canteen against a belt buckle, a whispered exchange between two soldiers who had been told to be silent, the creak of a rifle sling not tightly secured, a torch produced in a moment of disorientation, just for a second, just to check the compass, when the darkness became too complete and the uncertainty too unsettling to a soldier trained. In the conventional doctrine of the 1942 American Army, these were minor lapses, understandable human moments under stress, forgivable frailties in a man otherwise conducting himself with courage and professionalism. To an SAS patrol leader, each of those moments was a potential death sentence. Not for the man who made the sound, for every man in the patrol, and for every man in the patrol behind the next patrol. Because in the desert's deep silence, a silence so complete that veteran LRDG navigators reported hearing enemy vehicle engines at distances of 5 miles in still air, a single misplaced sound could reach a sentry's ear at 400 yards, and 400 yards was nothing in the open terrain of the Libyan plateau. The SAS doctrine was not merely cautious. It was uncompromising to a degree that seemed to outside observers almost monastic. It prohibited verbal communication during movement, except in emergencies, and even then, only in whispers at a halt. It required every piece of kit to be taped, tied, or wrapped before departure. It required that the approach to any target be rehearsed in daylight, with identical movement speeds and turn sequences, so that the darkness produced no surprises, requiring improvised decisions. It required that the withdrawal from any target begin at a pre-agreed time, regardless of what had or had not been accomplished, because the value of predictability, of being where the extraction point expected you to be, exceeded the marginal value of an extra bomb placed or an extra minute of disruption caused. These were not preferences. They were absolute rules, enforced by Lewes and Stirling with a rigidity that brooked no exception. A man who could not maintain them was returned to his unit, not criticized, not punished, returned without comment, without ceremony. It was not a reflection on his bravery. It was a reflection on his suitability for this particular form of warfare, and the Americans, with every quality one could ask for in a fighting man, with courage, with endurance, with an authentic desire to close with the enemy, had not been trained in this particular form of warfare, had not been trained to understand that silence was not the absence of noise, but the active construction of invisibility, had not been trained to reframe the concept of discipline from the parade ground enforcement of authority to the operational preservation of lives through the suppression of every unnecessary human signal. This was not their fault. It was a matter of what the United States Army in 1942 had been designed for. It had been designed for a war that was, in fact, coming, a vast industrial, continental war in which the ability to sustain mass operations under fire would be the decisive factor. That design was correct. It would be proven correct by Normandy, by the Hürtgen Forest, by the drive across Germany in 1945. But in the Libyan desert in 1942, it produced a gap in method, a gap in doctrine, and a gap that the SAS, with everything to lose on every patrol, could not afford to bridge by half-dash measures. So they didn't try to bridge it. They stepped across it instead. In practical terms, the phrase "don't follow us in" was less a formal order than an operational reality, communicated in various forms across various theaters, wherever British Special Forces operated alongside their American counterparts. It was not always spoken. Sometimes it was conveyed through the arrangement of a patrol, the SAS element departing 30 minutes before any liaison element, through a separate route, converging on a preset rendezvous point only after the target had been hit and the withdrawal was already complete. Sometimes it was communicated through the structure of the briefing itself, in which the SAS patrol leader would describe the approach route in terms, timing, movement technique, noise state, that made clear to any honest observer that the movement standard required was beyond what a recently arrived unit could meet on its first operation. It was never delivered as contempt. That distinction matters enormously. The SAS was not contemptuous of American soldiers. Stirling, who spent considerable time with American officers in Cairo in 1942 and 1943, expressed genuine admiration for their drive and their willingness to absorb new ideas. Paddy Mayne, who would later work alongside American and French units in northwestern Europe in 1944, extended the same hard-edged professional respect to Allied operators that he extended to everyone who was willing to do the difficult work. The SAS had no interest in hierarchy for its own sake. It had no tradition of institutional arrogance. Its ranks included Frenchmen, Irishmen, Rhodesians, anti-fascist Germans, and Greeks. It was, from its founding, a meritocracy of capability. The restriction was not about nationality. It was about training. It was about whether the man standing next to you in the dark had been taught the same language of movement that you had been taught, whether his hands had been taped the same way, whether his breathing under stress would remain measured and slow, or whether it quickened and become audible, whether, when the night went wrong, when the patrol hit an unexpected obstacle, or a sentry changed his route, or a dog began to bark 200 yards from the target perimeter, whether that man would freeze and wait, or whether he would move and produce a sound. These questions had no comfortable answers. And in a four-man patrol, operating 40 miles behind enemy lines, with no radio contact and no extraction option except their own feet, the wrong answer to any of them was fatal. The Lewes bomb sits at the center of this story, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. Consider what it was. A device small enough to conceal in a trouser pocket. A device that required no launcher, no assembly, no support mechanism. A device that one man could carry in sufficient quantities to destroy a dozen aircraft in a single night. It was, in the most precise sense of the term, a weapon of the individual, of the single, trained, disciplined, invisible operative. It could not be deployed by mass. It could not be deployed by firepower. It could not be scaled up by adding more resources or more men. The only thing that determined whether it worked was the quality of the man who carried it. Lewes had designed it as the companion to a philosophy. The philosophy that said, in certain kinds of warfare, the decisive variable is not strength, but precision, not volume, but placement, not the roar of the engine, but the absolute silence of the approach. The bomb was the product of weeks of Lewes conducting experiments that should by rights have killed him several times over, mixing thermite and plastic explosive and lubricating oil in quantities small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, testing the mixture until it burned hot enough and long enough to ignite aviation fuel and aircraft metal, without the enormous concussive blast that would wake every sentry in a 2-mile radius. He was not trying to make something louder. He was trying to make something quieter, more precise, more perfectly calibrated to the task of destroying a great machine with a small, silent hand. The bomb destroyed aircraft not with volume, but with chemistry. Not with a roar, but with a low, sustained, intense heat that spread from the wing root inward. By the time the first explosion was loud enough for a sentry to hear and turn toward, the patrol was already 300 yards away, moving in the dark, in silence, already ghosts. 400 aircraft destroyed in the North African campaign. That is the verified minimum. The Imperial War Museum's historians, looking at the available records, have estimated the real figure was closer to 450. In just over 2 years of operations, a force that never exceeded 400 men destroyed more enemy aircraft than the combined aerial operations of multiple Allied fighter squadrons in the same theater. They did it without air superiority, without artillery support, without supply convoys, without established lines of advance or retreat. They did it with small bags of wax-coated explosive, the stars of the Libyan night, and a silence so absolute. It had become a form of architecture. No American unit in the North African theater matched those numbers. Not because American soldiers were incapable, but because the American military apparatus in 1942 was not built for this kind of war. It was built for a different kind, a larger kind, a kind that was coming and that America would win. But this particular conversation between a man and a sleeping aircraft in the dark required something different, something that could not be requisitioned, delivered, or scaled, something that could only be earned one night at a chi. Time in the dark. The collision between these two doctrines became most visible in the months following America's entry into the North African ground war. At the Battle of Kazarini Pass in February 1943, American forces met the German Afrika Korps in the first major engagement between the United States Army and experienced German armored units. The result was a rout. Not because American soldiers lacked courage, they fought in many cases with extraordinary individual bravery, but because the unit had not yet learned what the desert required: poor reconnaissance, piecemeal deployment, inadequate coordination between infantry and armor, and a fundamental mismatch between the doctrine they had been trained in and the conditions they actually faced. The pass fell. 80 miles of ground was conceded in 2 days. Thousands of American soldiers were killed, captured, or dispersed. It was, as historians of the campaign have noted, a humiliation of strategic consequence, but also of a particular instructive value, because Kasserine forced the United States Army in North Africa to stop, examine itself, and rebuild around the lessons the desert had taught it. General Eisenhower replaced General Fetendel with General Patton. New training programs were instituted. The relationship between American conventional forces and Allied Special Operations units was reconsidered, restructured, and rebuilt. On more honest terms, the SAS was watching all of this with the particular attention of men who operated in the same terrain, under the same sky, and understood with molecular precision what the desert punished and what it rewarded. What it punished was noise. What it punished was predictability. What it punished was the assumption that more was always more. What it rewarded was patience, preparation, the willingness to construct silence, not as an accident, but as an intention. The willingness to take fewer men, less equipment, less firepower, and replace the deficit with training so rigorous and discipline so absolute that the patrol itself became a precision instrument, not a blunt one. The deeper truth of the SAS doctrine was philosophical rather than merely tactical. It was, at its core, an argument about what a human being was worth in the context of war. Conventional military doctrine in 1942, in virtually every major army in the world, treated soldiers as units of production. You needed a certain number of units to take a certain objective. You lost some units in the taking. You replaced those units from the available pool. The calculation was not callous in intention. It was the only arithmetic that made sense when you were trying to move hundreds of thousands of men across continents. But it produced, inevitably, a way of thinking about soldiers that reduced their individual quality to a mean. You planned for the average, the adequate. The replaceable Stirling refused this arithmetic entirely. In his founding memorandum, the document he handed to General Ritchie while standing on crutches in an office he had no right to be in. Stirling wrote that his proposed unit would operate on the principle that strength of a patrol is not its numbers, but the caliber on every individual in it. He was not simply making an observation about training standards. He was proposing a revolution in the unit of account. The patrol was not a collection of soldiers. It was a multiplier of individual excellence. Every man in it had to be worthy of every other man in it. Every man had to be so precisely trained, so thoroughly reliable, so deeply invested in the collective survival of the unit, that the patrol could function as a single organism rather than as a group of individuals making independent decisions. This was why the selection process was so harsh. Not to eliminate the weak, Stirling had no particular interest in conventional measures of physical toughness, and his unit included men of varying physical types. But to find the men who, under extreme stress, in extreme darkness, facing extreme danger, would not in any single moment prioritize their own comfort, their own fear, or their own judgment over the established protocols of the patrol. The men who would not reach for the torch. The man who would not let the whisper escape. The man who would not, at the critical moment of the approach, take the small, human, understandable, and absolutely fatal step of making a sound. That man was worth more than any quantity of resources. He was irreplaceable. He was, in the desert's terminology, the only kind of soldier who could survive. And that was why the SAS left American units behind in the summer of 1944, long after the Desert Campaign had ended, after Sicily and Italy, and the long preparation in the Scottish moorlands for the Allied invasion of Normandy. The SAS carried its doctrine into the forests and farmlands of occupied France. The war had changed shape entirely. The desert was thousands of miles and 2 years behind them. But the philosophy had not changed. The Lewes bomb had been replaced by more sophisticated charges. The sand had been replaced by forest tracks and village lanes. The Libyan stars had been replaced by the Norman darkness of June, thick with cloud and rain and the distant thunder of naval artillery. But the patrol moved in the same way. 4 men. Silence. Absolute silence. Every step was rehearsed. Every piece of kit was checked and rechecked. In France, the SAS worked alongside French resistance fighters, OSS operatives, and a range of Allied liaison officers, American among them. The same conversation that had taken place in the desert took place again, in different languages, in different landscapes, but with the same essential content. There are ways of moving that keep you alive. There are ways of moving that do not. We have learned the difference in the hardest possible school against one of the most experienced armies in the world. We will share what we know. But in the field, you will either move the way we move or you will not move with us. Operation Bullbasket, launched in June 1944, parachuted B Squadron of the 1st SAS into the Vienne region of central France, tasked with disrupting the railway lines supplying German forces resisting the Normandy landings. For weeks, a tiny group of SAS men moved through occupied territory, living in the woods, supplied by airdrops, destroying trains and fuel convoys with the same philosophical economy they had applied to Rommel's airfields 3 years earlier. When they were eventually compromised and the Germans closed in, 31 men were captured and executed, not in battle. Executed, shot in cold blood on orders of the SS. The cost of being found was not captured. It was death. This was the knowledge that lay beneath every decision, every protocol, every absolute prohibition against unnecessary sound. The men who carried it were not grim or fearful. By all accounts, they were among the most cheerful soldiers. In the British Army, Paddy Mayne drove his jeep through occupied France with an Irish ballad playing on a portable phonograph. David Stirling had spent his pre-war years in Paris, drawing paintings and planning Himalayan climbs. These were not men who had been broken into compliance by a harsh system. They were men who understood, with full intelligence and full humanity, exactly what the silence was for, and they were entirely willing to maintain it. There is an image that returns in the accounts of men who served alongside the SAS and watched them depart for a night operation, again and again, in different words, but with the same essential visual. Content. The patrol assembles at some distance from the vehicles. There is a final equipment check, conducted in silence. The patrol leader walks the line, pausing at each man, running a hand over their kit, not with the mechanical indifference of a routine inspection, but with the specific, calibrated attention of someone who understands that what they are touching is the architecture of survival. The canteen is secured. The weapons sling silent. The boots were wrapped. The face is dark. The hands taped. Then they move, and within 20 steps they are gone, not behind cover, not into the shadows. They simply cease to be visible in the way that men are visible, as upright shapes producing sound and light and heat, and the thousand small signals by which human presence announces itself in the world. They become something else. Something. The desert had made them. Something quiet enough and small enough and precisely enough trained that the night itself accepted them. American officers who witnessed this, in the desert and in Europe, reported the same disquiet. Not shame or resentment, but something more honest, the recognition that they were watching a form of mastery they had not yet achieved. A form of warfare whose requirements were not material but personal, not about equipment or numbers or logistics or supply chains, but about what a man had decided to be and what he was willing to maintain that decision under every kind of pressure. General Sir Miles Dempsey, commanding the British Second Army, told Paddy Mayne after the Normandy campaign, having commanded many units in a long career, that he had never encountered a unit in which he placed such complete confidence. The confidence was not about bravery. The British Army had plenty of brave men. It was about reliability, about the absolute certainty that when Mayne's men were given a task, they would accomplish it, or they would die in the attempt. And either way, they would not betray the patrol. That reliability had been built at Kabrit in the Egyptian desert in 1941 by a scholarly Welsh-Australian lieutenant with explosive burns on his hands, who believed that discipline was not a constraint on the warrior, but the warrior's essential tool. It had been refined by a tall Scottish aristocrat who thought about war the way a climber thinks about a mountain, as a problem of access, route finding, and the particular courage required not to rush the final approach. It had been carried forward by an enormous Ulsterman who could destroy 47 aircraft in a single night and who drove through occupied France, playing folk music at low volume, because On a jeep moving fast through enemy lines, he had calculated correctly that a certain kind of sound was noise, and a certain kind of sound was cover. It was, in every sense, a different philosophy of war. Not better than the American approach in every theater, not applicable to every situation, not the kind of thing that could win a war by itself, but essential, irreplaceable, the kind of approach that, when it was absent, left a gap in the Allied capability that nothing else could fill. The war ended in 1945. The SAS was formally disbanded on the 1st of October of that year, dissolved by an army that had returned to its conventional instincts and saw little peacetime role for the particular arts these men had practiced. Stirling was by then a prisoner at Colditz, having been captured in Tunisia in January 1943, sold to the Germans by Arab middlemen for 11 pounds of tea, in what stands as one of the more undignified conclusions to a legendary career. He had spent the remaining years of the war attempting, unsuccessfully, to escape. He was knighted shortly before his death in 1990. Paddy Mayne returned to County Down and drove his red Riley sports car along the roads of his childhood and lived the restless, unconsoled life of a man who had been designed for a world that no longer existed. He died in a traffic accident in New Townards in December 1955, 40 years old, still carrying the recommendation for a Victoria Cross that had been denied him by a military establishment that had never quite forgiven him for being who he was. King George VI himself had reportedly inquired why the honor had so strangely eluded him. It remained unanswered. Jock Lewes never came home. He was killed by German aircraft strafing in the Libyan desert on the 30th of December, 1941. Just weeks after the raids he had trained others to perform had begun to demonstrate everything he had theorized about silent warfare. He was 28 years old. His bomb outlived him by years, placed in the dark on the wings of 100 silent aircraft by the men he had trained to walk without sound. What the SAS left behind when they stepped away from the American units and moved into the dark was not a statement about superiority. It was a statement about possibility, about what human beings could become when trained with sufficient rigor, selected with sufficient honesty, and given, in the words of the man who built them, not orders but philosophy. Stirling had written in that original memorandum that the SAS's greatest enemy was not the Afrika Korps or the Luftwaffe or the desert itself. The greatest enemy was the assumption that war was something that could only be fought at scale, that only mass could defeat mass, that only volume could defeat volume, that the individual soldier, no matter how capable, was ultimately just a number in a calculation that required more numbers. The SAS had disproven that assumption 400 times. In 400 sets of burning aircraft wings, in the Libyan darkness, in the absence of any sound except the low chemistry of a Lewes bomb beginning its work, they had done it by moving in silence, by refusing every comfort that produced a signal, by accepting a form of discipline so complete that it had ceased to be discipline and had become something else, a way of existing in the world, close to the enemy, invisible, patient, and absolutely sure of the moment to act. They had done it in the end by daring, not the loud daring of the charge, not the spectacular daring of the artillery bombardment or the massed armored assault, the quiet daring of 4 men in the dark, a canvas bag between them, walking toward a sleeping airfield at the pace of the desert night, making no sound at all. Who dares wins. It had always been the quieter part of the sentence that mattered most. Who dares? The verb, not the noun, the act of deciding, the moment of choosing voluntarily to walk toward the thing that could kill you, with no more equipment than necessary, in the company of exactly the men required, and in a silence so practiced and so absolute that the darkness itself did not know you were there. That was what the SAS was. That was what it cost to walk with them. And that was why, before every patrol, when the preparations were complete, and the Lewes bombs were counted, and the boots were wrapped, and the kits were checked one final time, they turned to the men who were not yet ready and said the only honest thing there was to say.